and appointments can be recurring. So that's one thing to note. But in terms of if I wanted to have a recurring task, I think there's probably a few different ways to do it. So as part of the follow-up to the question, it was suggested maybe we should use a master task table. And from that master task table, we figure out what tasks are maybe recurring and how they should recur. And then we have a Power Automate flow that runs to basically create new tasks whenever they need to be created based on the master table. That's one way to do it. There's probably a couple other ways to do it. Another way you might consider might be to simply have a Power Automate flow that runs on a scheduled basis and creates the tasks that it needs to. So rather than looking at a master task table, you could literally just say, well, the logic that I need can be built into a single flow that runs every Friday to schedule a task for every Monday or something like that. That might be a simple way to do it. And then probably the other way, and this is something that I've done in the past, is you can do something like, and it depends on your scenario, but if you have a scenario where, let's say those recurring tasks may be dependent on one another. So for example, instead of creating a task on a Friday and then assuming you're going to create the same task on the next Friday, when the first Friday task may not have been completed. Like that may be an open question. So if you want somebody to complete the first task first before the second task becomes available, you can do something like create a Power Automate flow that will trigger on the completion of the task and then have some logic implemented to create the next task based on when the first one was completed and so on and so forth. And so it's kind of like a daisy chain of tasks. That's another way to do it. There is, there's some licensing implications. So if you're using Dataverse and you're using a service account or you're using your own account to run that Power Automate flow, in any of those scenarios, that service account would need to have a license to Power Apps to be able to connect to Dataverse and create the tasks and manipulate them and do all of those things. But I feel like if you've graduated to that, you probably are purchasing licenses for your users anyways at some level. And so you're going to have to sort out the licensing question. But yeah, that's a good question. There's a few different ways to solve it. I would say, I think there was another piggyback to that question, which was something like, should I create the tasks, or if I create a new entity, should it be an activity type or not? I would model anything new that you create that's going to be like a task after the actual task that's built in. So the task itself is an activity, and that means that it has some special capability inside of Dynamics or inside of Dataverse. So some of the things that you would get with that automatically out of the box are it shows up in the timeline of an entity. So if you create a task and it's associated or regarding some other thing, let's say a case or a deal or an account or something like that, and you go look at the timeline of that entity, you'll see all of the tasks that were completed, and you'll want yours to basically show up the same way and behave the same way because you're trying to do that. And then the only other thing that I would say there is if you're thinking about using stuff that's very similar to what's already built into the basic Dataverse entity model, see what you can do to use those things out of the box and as designed before you go doing a great deal of customization.
Yeah, it's always good advice. See what you can make work before you actually go build it all. So that was a pretty technical question that definitely had a few layers to it. So we appreciate you, Mike, for answering all of that. But for those just joining now on YouTube and for those in the Teams meeting, we do want to encourage you to ask both technical and non-technical questions. We would love to have some topics around communication or streamlining collaboration at your business. So you don't just have to bring more of the technical questions. We are open to all. So with that, let's go into our second question. This one's a little less technical. The question came a few days ago, and they were asking how to add a timestamp or a time span, to a Teams meeting invitation. So we talked about this question a little bit. Part of us wanted a little bit more context on this, but at the same time, I think I know what they're getting at. I think really what they're asking is, if you've been on a Teams meeting, you know when you have 5 minutes left in your meeting, you see that little reminder of you have 5 minutes left in your meeting. And where that's coming from is the time span that you've scheduled the meeting for. So if you scheduled it for 60 minutes, that's going to happen at 55 minutes. If you scheduled it for 30 minutes, that'll happen at 25 minutes. It is a great reminder. I think teams built it likely based on the fact that there's a lot of feedback in user groups of people saying, I always have to remind people we only have 5 minutes left in our meeting. So teams will do that for you, but all of that is dependent on what you actually scheduled that meeting for. So I hope that helps. I'm not sure if that answers the question fully, but if you have more questions around that, definitely drop them in the chat. So that was our second question. Let's look through to see if we had any others.
Also, feel free to post where you're joining from. That's always interesting. We always like to see.
Yeah.
Sometimes we get people from all over the world joining these, and that's kind of fun.
People in the studio, did we get through those were just the 2 questions, right, that were, okay.
I was going to look as a follow-up to that Teams question.
Yes.
I was going to, because I think there was a note in there about like triggering something in Power Automate, and I was going to go look and see what actions were available in Power Automate to see maybe if there was a limitation on creating a team meeting inside of Power Automate. Maybe that's what the question was related to, but I'm not 100% sure.
All right, I'm going to read this question from Andrew while we look into that. Looking for suggestions on how to most effectively utilize Microsoft 365 tools and apps to collaborate on project development, including stage gate process and dashboards for reporting to leadership on progress of these projects. Great question.
So project development, dashboards, reporting. So there's a lot of different tools you could use, and it may depend on what you're familiar with or what you're used to using. So in the simplest form, you could use something like Planner. That's going to be fairly limited in terms of how well it assigns tasks and the automation that you can connect to it, and the reporting that you're going to get out of it. It's going to be fairly simplistic, but it's also free and pretty easy for people to use and understand. So then follow-up question here, does Planner integrate with Teams channels? That is a good question. I think when you can create a Planner board for any topic that you want to create, but whenever you create a Planner board, you'll get one like that's associated with the team. You'd have to probably create another Planner board that would be associated with the channel specifically. So I don't think it's like a direct, like automatic connection, but you certainly could create a Planner board dedicated to whatever topic that your channel was dedicated for, and then you could secure it that way as well. The other thing to note about that is whether or not you care about the permission. So in terms of private channels versus public channels, right? When you create a private channel, then you'll probably care a little bit more about the permission. And when you do that, for example, a private channel in Teams basically generates a whole separate SharePoint site collection behind the scenes to store files and all of that kind of stuff as well. And so Planner will probably get treated much the same way in that regard in terms of permissions. One
thing we've been kind of experimenting with, I think would be the word, is the new tool Loop and how that integrates with all of the Microsoft 365 tools. Loop is still very much in its early days, but I've learned a lot more about Planner because within Loop you can create tasks and those will automatically create a Planner board and link, and then you can create a Loop component, which then allows you to use when you're talking about reporting to leadership and kind of creating these higher level views. I do feel like Loop's a quick and dirty way to do that, especially if you just are in that experimenting phase. So I would encourage you to check out Loop and just understand how that's going to help with project management, but also task management.
Yeah, so Loop is a cool tool, and along the lines of what you were saying, Loop is an easy tool to tell stories with.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
That's what I think we're finding. So when you're telling the story to leadership about performance or progress on projects or something like that, it can be an easy way to like put all of that story together in a way that's easy to present. So
without having to create a whole slide deck and all that.
Yep. So Andrew, you followed up with, is Loop out of beta? It is not. It's still beta. There's a lot of stuff to be done. We're hoping that Microsoft keeps working on it until it gets all the way there and doesn't like give up on it 75% of the way. Because
Which I highly doubt they will. I mean,
don't think so.
it's such a powerful tool already.
Well, in today's world, they have to compete with things like Notion.
Right.
Right.
And Notion's full steam ahead. I mean,
Yep.
they're launching new features every
Right.
single week.
Yep. So it's a cool tool in that regard. I think I want to go back to your other part of your question about data and dashboards and stuff like that. So when you're using Planner, you get a pretty simple dashboard that'll give you like overall status of tasks and how many tasks are still open or how many tasks are in various stages depending on how you set up your Planner board. And it's pretty rudimentary, and maybe that's good enough. If you need deeper analytics, you might want to look into something like MS Project or Project Online, or potentially building a homegrown solution. There are other tools like DevOps if you want to go there that allow. It's kind of a more software development centric way to manage tasks and projects. But that can also be customized any which way you would like to meet your needs as well. It just depends on what level you need. And then the other thing to say about the data and the dashboard side of things is Loop is a great tool for assembling a story and presenting that story to your leadership team. However, they may have a desire for like self-serve access to data, right?
Yes.
And so in that scenario, you probably want to look at something like Power BI, where you can pull in the data from whatever the sources are. So you could potentially pull data from Planner, you could pull data from SharePoint, you could pull data from Dataverse, MS Project, right? A lot of different sources. And then you could present that in a compelling visual way and then share that with leadership, and then they can go access it whenever they want, and you can refresh that data every day or every hour or whatever you need to do, and they're always up to date. And that can be a great tool to use.
Just to close the loop on Loop, looks like Andrew is asking, I don't see Loop in my Microsoft 365 apps list. Do I need to download the beta? I believe it's an admin setting at your tenant level that needs to be turned on.
Yeah, so if you are an admin or if you have access to the admin folks, you'll have to ask them to enable that in your tenant or for your organization. And then they may also, beyond that, enable it for specific users. So that's also a possible thing to consider.
Oh, thanks. Yep, Mitch just dropped a link in the chat to learn all about that. All right, thanks for the question, Andrew. Hope that helps. Looks like Aaron on YouTube has a question for us. Will users need access to premium Dataverse connectors to read environment variables in Power Automate flows? And then she has a follow-up.
So that is let me think about that for a minute.
Yeah.
Because I've done some things to work around the licensing thing. So the correct way to do it.
Let's start there with what's the right way.
So the best practice would be your flows should be developed inside of a solution. So your flows will become solution aware. And then if your flows are solution aware, they'll also be able to access environment variables. And getting to the environment variables is not necessarily a Dataverse license requirement. Okay, so one way that you can get at environment variables is kind of through the back door, and you can directly go directly at the environment variable tables that are in Dataverse and query them and retrieve data. And you can absolutely do that. If you're going to do it that way, you must have a license. However, if you're building a solution, let's say in the default environment, and you add flows to that solution, you will be able to create environment variables in that solution, and your flows will be able to access those environment variables, and they'll show up in your list of dynamic content alongside all of the other variables and things inside of your flow. And that does not require a premium connector license. All right, the follow-up question there was, I have a Power Automate flow that reads an environment variable. So trying to determine whether or not we're in test or prod. So that's a fairly common scenario. And we're trying to determine if end users will need to have the premium licensing. So the answer is no. They won't have to have the premium licensing for that. Where you'll get into that is if you happen to use the Dataverse connector specifically inside of your flow. So that is the distinction. The Dataverse actions or things that use the Dataverse connector specifically our premium connector license required. Good question, though.
Yes. All right, so that was YouTube question. You're welcome, Aaron. Now let's look over at Teams. We've got a question about help tickets. So with a help ticket type app, what is the best way to handle attachments, PDF or images, within SharePoint list or other means like OneDrive? And I think he's asking, this is from Neil, more about...
To me, it's like this is an information architecture design question. Like,
right.
Where do I put my documents if I have a help a ticketing system?
If they're a PDF, a JPEG,
Yep.
a PNG,
Yep.
that sort of thing.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So if we're going to assume that SharePoint is your repository for your tickets, there's a couple ways you can do it. One would be to, let's say your tickets are in a list of tickets and it's just a list, so not a document library. You can add attachments to the list items. So that would probably be the easiest method, like the most out of the box, ready to go, it'll just work. So if you're doing that, a couple ways that you can manage the attachments. One would be directly inside of SharePoint. You can get at the attachments column and then you can allow users to add attachments. The other method is if you're, there's probably two ways to go about it. One would be a custom SharePoint list form using Canvas apps. So that's a Power Apps thing, or a straight up Canvas app directly. And in both of those scenarios, you basically can create a form inside of your app. So a screen that like basically points at your SharePoint list. And so you'll have a gallery. And then when you click something in the gallery, you'll go to the edit screen. Right, but those forms will be connected to SharePoint, and all you really have to do is add the attachment field to that form, and then users can add attachments and do all of that good stuff. So that would be one way. Another mechanism, let's say your ticketing system for some reason needed to be more document-centric, where the document was the important thing, not so much the actual request or the submission. In that scenario, you might consider using a document library to store the files themselves and then have an accompanying list that would be the requests. And then in that request list, you could add a column that would basically be a URL or a link to the document that in the other in the document library. There are some limitations to that, right? So if you want to allow multiple documents per submission, you have to accommodate that. So you would either have to create another list that keeps track of all of the documents submitted for this specific request, or you would have to create a column per document. So let's say you said, well, there's only ever going to be 5, so I'll do it with 5 columns. You could do that too, but that's probably not the ideal way. I think attachments is probably the easiest out of the box solution. Attachments on list items. Yep.
It's a good answer.
Maybe. Did it make sense to you?
It made sense. I think that's. I feel like most of your answers within this office hours have been, first look at what's the frictionless option.
Yes.
What?
Yeah.
Right.
Don't get yourself in too deep.
It seems as if it's the obvious answer, but at the same time, it's right. It's the right place to start.
Yeah.
All right. It doesn't look like we have any other questions coming in, so just want to encourage everyone who's on. Feel free to drop questions about just work life, office space, what you're implementing right now on your team. We were talking this morning about one of our coworkers had a conversation over the weekend with someone he was with who sort of fought us on our principle that you shouldn't run your business with Excel. So
Yeah.
we heard about that conversation, and we stand strong and stand firm in our principles that there are better ways of doing things than running your business in Excel.
Maybe we should have a debate.
We could. I don't want to be on the other side of that, though, because I don't think
That might be kind of fun. That'd be fun.
Play devil's advocate.
So a follow-up to the team's time span question. So
Oh, yeah.
just because I saw in the notes on that question something about a Power Automate trigger. So you can create a Teams meeting in Power Automate. Like that's a legitimate action, and it has a start time and an end time property that you can set. So if you are, let's say, you know what time you want the meeting to start and you know it needs to be 60 minutes, for example, you can use an expression and basically set your start time, right, in a variable, and then use an expression to get start time plus 60 minutes. That would be the easy way to do it if you were starting from that time span centered approach, but perfectly doable inside of Power Automate. So.
Love it. Erin's got another question for us. She asks, what are the benefits of using parent/child flows?
Ooh, I love this
Which
question.
I believe we may have some blogs and videos on this.
I'm pretty sure we do.
So we'll have to drop those in the chat. But yeah, what do you think, Mike?
So, so sorry, I was getting a little bit of music in my ear.
Oh.
It threw me off for a second. So I absolutely love this question because parent-child flows is one of those things that enables high quality solution design inside of no-code, low-code, inside of the Power Platform.
Mm-hmm.
So think of parent-child flows in terms like there's a lot of different things that you can do with it, but one of the great benefits of it is you can build a piece of logic one time, and then you can use that same piece of logic, in 500 other places just by calling it because it's child flow. And so then when you find a bug or when that specific logic needs to change in some way, you can then change it in one place instead of having to go to all of those 500 places and make the same change. So that would probably be one of the biggest benefits. It's just going to save you time. It's going to be less bugs to track down, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's less copy paste, right? So the alternative, or just to draw some contrast, a real alternative to using child flows would be copy paste. Because you can copy paste code, you could copy paste actions.
But who wants to do
from
that?
one flow to another. So that's absolutely right. So in order to use parent and child flows, though, you do need to the flows need to be solution aware, so they need to be inside of a solution. So you can't just in your default environment start creating flows and expect to call other flows that way. There are ways to trigger other flows through things like HTTP requests and stuff like that, but those aren't always the most secure. So parent-child flow gives you a more secure way to do that, but they do need to be inside of a solution.
And we're linking some of those
3 reasons.
resources through both YouTube and Teams. So check out our blog there. And if you go to our website through that link and navigate to the Learn tab up in the right-hand corner, you'll have access then to all of our different blogs, and you can search and filter by the different topics that you might be interested in.
I don't know if it's in that blog, but I was just thinking about another. Sometimes child flows can be used to you can do things with child flows that allow you to run under a different context, so a different user context than what the other flow does. So you may have a scenario where even inside of Dataverse, where users are all licensed and things like that, where you need to elevate the privileges of a particular action to be able to do something. And so then you could run that child flow under a service account that has more permissions inside of that environment. So it's another way to separate logic so that users who need to do the normal things that all the users do can, but you don't want to let them in the admin door or that higher elevated privileges door. So then you can call a child flow that actually runs under the context of a different account so that it can do more elevated privileges. And that pattern is a pretty common pattern in in the old .NET world. If you're familiar with building web forms and things like that, there would be always a way to elevate privileges so that you could do an extra special thing that you wouldn't want to allow your users to have direct access to do. So that's another thing. And I don't think that particular pattern is articulated in that blog post, but just another thing that popped into my mind.
Yeah. I feel like we've been asked about parent-child flows enough before. It's just come up enough that that's what led us to. We've probably discussed it internally as well, quite a bit. So, good question. Thanks, Erin. Yeah,
we use it extensively on some of our projects, actually.
Yeah. All All right. Any other questions? Feel free to drop in the chat. We are here to answer.
Yay.
Oh man, here we go. All right. Oh man, hot button issue. Slack versus Teams, pros, cons. Do you prefer one over the other?
I'm gonna let you answer first.
Oh man. Okay.
This is interesting because there's certain people in the organization who are like highly opinionated about it, right? The reality is everyone on our team uses both.
Right.
Right. And so everyone has an opinion and a preference.
Well, and I think it is hard. Slack versus Teams, there's also a Teams preview that's now available, and they've made a lot of updates within the new Teams. We also have a blog post about that. So it is hard. I don't use the new Teams extensively right now because it had some bugs, so I switched back to the old Teams. I think I would be more 50-50 if it was Slack versus new Teams was the question. But Slack versus old Teams, or the Teams I'm using now, in my mind, Slack wins for what I use it for and how I utilize the tool. Specifically, the mobile version just feels very seamless to me, and I'm able to keep in contact with coworkers when I'm on the go. So if I'm in meetings and I don't have my laptop open or I'm not able to navigate because I'm sharing my screen, having Slack have such a seamless mobile option, that does really help. Teams does have a mobile option. It is fine, but I think the Slack version, especially the way we use it, the number of channels that we have, it just works better for me. And that would be the pro on the Slack side.
Yeah.
The con on the Slack side, from my perspective, is collaboration. They just launched something called Canvases. It's not seamless to use, in my opinion. Maybe I need to learn more about using it. I've used it a few times now in the last 2-3 weeks, but collaborating within Slack is clunky from my experience. Collaborating within Teams is more seamless, specifically because we have all of our files shared in Teams. So there's just an easier link and collaborating happening in Teams. But we also use them together, so you are able to use the best of both worlds, which is something we do at Bulb Digital.
Yeah, and like in many ways, we're forced into keeping both around.
Yes.
So for me, Slack is hugely beneficial when I need to communicate with people outside of my organization.
Sure.
Because the external integration in Teams, while you can do it, that is clunky.
Yes.
Or cumbersome to set up.
And was very cumbersome within the old Teams where you couldn't just switch between different tenants and things.
Yep.
Now you can switch between tenants and get notified of what's going on in other tenants when you're in a different tenant on the new Teams. So kudos to Microsoft, Gold Star. That's a great new feature.
That has been a long time coming. And so that's one of the reasons that Slack, for us at least, is still hung around.
Right.
So that's probably, for me, that's probably the biggest benefit of Slack. On the downside, I'll tell you, one of the biggest struggles I have with Slack is joining huddles and remembering my device settings. It never works. And so every time I do it, I'm like starting a huddle and I'm like, can you hear me? How about now? Can you hear me now? Well, I can't hear you.
To the point that we'll start a huddle and someone else will just start a Teams meeting and we'll all just switch over to the Teams meeting.
Right. Which I don't know why that is, but it seems like you could, because Teams saves the setting, and then the next time you go, you're good to go, right? So that's probably a complaint that I have about Slack. On the Teams side of things, I think this is where, at the end of the day, Microsoft and Teams may ultimately win this battle, and that is whenever we're doing things where we're collaborating on a document, or we're sharing a report, or we're looking at a statement of work, and like all of that kind of stuff, the notification will come in Teams, right? Number one, or typically will. Or if nobody sends me a direct notification or shares it with me, I may have notifications turned on for that container already, and so then I'll see that the file was created. And so then Teams on my mobile device becomes the natural application that I use to access that content. And
it'd be nice if you could just give feedback or have a conversation right within that.
So then I can do all of that stuff right there inside of Teams, and that happens simply, it's kind of like natural because, well, our Office documents are in Teams, in SharePoint, in that ecosystem, not in the Slack ecosystem.
Right.
And so until Slack has a competing ecosystem, like they're going to face real challenges because people are just going to be kind of like driven into Teams through those other mechanisms.
I really like the way that Slack has threads as well.
Yeah.
I know we go back and forth. Sometimes you get notified a little differently within threads, and Teams does have a form of this, but for some reason, again, Slack does feel as if it makes more intuitive sense. With all of these tools, as we're seeing with like bookings versus Calendly versus, it does feel like in the market, or Notion versus Loop, in the market, other companies come in, and Andrew, this kind of goes to your question here. You asked, do you all have experience with Asana? How does that compare to Slack and Teams? It's like these other platforms pop up, and they start doing something really, really well. I got to give some kudos to Microsoft in that they listen, and then they try to incorporate. Yeah. So ultimately, if everyone is on a Teams platform, it does feel as if it will win in the long run if they can make their tools compete, because none of us want to get to a place where we're using 13 different platforms.
True. So you're right. Slack does a better job of user experience when it comes to conversational threads.
Yes, like back and forth, quick. Maybe if you're going to do a funny GIF or something, but you don't want that to be on your screen 24/7, you can close it out.
Right, yeah. So, and Teams has been catching up, right? I think the Teams preview has some of those. They've made some things better.
Yes.
But as you mentioned, it's buggy and it crashes for me every day. So
yes, so I switched back.
I switched back too. So I think that's interesting in terms of all of the other tools. Like the fact is, if you're using like Outlook for your email, like you've got Office 365, and you're kind of stuck in that platform unless you want to re-platform, which is a big deal. And because like Microsoft kind of has that cornered, like you're kind of stuck in that world. So then it's a question of, do I use the Microsoft tools? Are they good enough? Right? And you might say, yeah, let's try to do that. But I think, as you kind of mentioned, like there's a different level. Like these other companies will come in.
Hey, Mitch.
These other companies will come in and they'll build something that's really great.
Yes.
They knock it out of the park. The great news is, even if you're stuck in that Microsoft world, chances are you can integrate with that thing.
Right.
And so you can,
as we've done.
You can have the best of both worlds.
Yeah.
Right.
Everyone welcome Mitch.
All
right.
Teams was built for the enterprise. Slack was built for people.
Hot take.
All right.
I think I agree with that.
This is personal preference. Slack, I love the one thread conversation style where you can dive into a deeper conversation by starting a thread.
Yes.
But Teams does it by default. So every single message that you start in a channel, there's like a big weight to it where it warrants a conversation. Like you have to start a new post. You have to start a new conversation that does not feel casual at all.
You just articulated what I couldn't quite put my finger on. That's it.
Yeah.
That's why I think it feels more intuitive on Slack.
It's less chatty.
And I'm a chatty person, so.
Yeah, right. It's less chat-like.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Which, again, in a large enterprise, it makes sense to sort of put up those little walls of, you don't want a bunch of chat. But when I'm collaborating with a team, I want to just be able to like send messages and not worry about exactly where I'm responding all the time, and like,
allow it to be more
colloquial
and just casual.
Yeah. I have thoughts on this, so
I
wired up a microphone and I jumped in here.
We've been through like I remember being like there's a learning curve too, right? So when we first started using Slack, and we're talking years ago, right? It was like, oh, I see you're having that conversation right out in the open. You should put that in a thread. And we all had to learn how to use that and be effective with it, right? And so they're like, to your point, Mitch, is like, well, maybe Microsoft figured that out and said, well, let's try to guide people into that as a starting point. Maybe. I don't know.
Matt Kahn asked, does Slack do threads too? Yes, Matt Kahn. Slack does threads too.
We've been talking about how that's a favorite feature of mine.
Andrew asked
about, is it Asana? I haven't used Asana.
I have a little bit.
Are they connected in with that Monday.com, that project management? No,
different.
That's different.
It's
okay.
My 2 cents is Asana was born as a like project management tool, and so it does that well, and it's been expanding into like ancillary areas. I don't know how well it does on day-to-day casual conversation about topics. I know from a project management standpoint, it can do conversations about a project. Like if you need to have a discussion about a project, about a task or something like that, it's fully integrated in there and it does well. But from a, let's have a conversation about something not project related, be it like a topic like business operations or something.
Asana is not a communications tool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know that. I haven't looked in a while to know if they do have that now or not, but it was definitely project management at first.
And that's a good point. So I think the way we talk about Slack and Teams and channels and all that good stuff is that you can take what is really a communication tool, but then also make it into a powerful project management tool. So if you set your Slack and Teams channels up properly, not that there's a right way to do it, but if you do have, project-based channels or we like to talk about it as topic-based channels, then you can do kind of what Mitch was talking about within a project management space or have conversations specifically to a project. You can kind of get the best of both worlds from a Slack or a Teams. So like we said, we don't have a ton of experience with Asana, but
Well, and I think the
I'm
hope
Team Slack, so
the hope there with something like Loop as well is to integrate your conversations into your documents and vice versa, right? Like, and put all of those things together.
yeah.
And once that's like fully baked and all there, I think that's going to be a very powerful tool.
So Andrew, you asked a great question. Do you have any tutorials on how to most effectively set up channels for this? We actually have a webinar that we've been doing monthly, and we're going to continue to do that. I believe we have it on demand, so we can post a link to that. But the webinar is all about internal communication and just all the best practices around that. And the second topic within that is all on topic-based communication, setting up channels. We do stay somewhat generalized and broad, but that would be the first tool I would send you to watch that. Feel free to skip to the second half if you really want to focus on the topic-based communication. Please join us. We have one coming up August 30th that we'll be doing all around internal communication. It's one of our favorite topics. But yes, I think getting the channel set up correctly, in some ways, it is hard to tell someone how to do it without understanding their business fully, but there are best practices for it. And if you have an intranet and other internal landing pages, there's a whole strategy to make sure all that ecosystem works together.
So I'm gonna super plug the webinar. So.
Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, so
I'm on it, so.
As Emma said, that's the good first place to start.
Yes.
And the reason for that is, like, you could dive right into Teams and be like, oh, I'm going to create a channel for this and a team for that and private channel for that. But you really want to get the approach and the mindset squared away so that when you start to dive into, now it's time to create, you have a good foundation and you can quickly answer the question, should this be a team or should this be a channel? Right?
Yes.
And so there's a time for that, but like start high level, think big picture, get your approach squared away as it pertains to your organization before you dive into the deep how-to side of it. Mm-hmm. And that's what the webinar is for.
Yes.
That's where it starts.
Yeah.
So
we try to help you set up that mindset, and then also understanding and diagnosing, most of the time, 95% of the time, your business is doing it one way, and there is going to be some change management involved. So we do have some strategies for, okay, sounds like you want to change or sounds like you want to set things up correctly, but how does everyone else feel? And then what are some strategies to get everyone rowing in the same direction on board? One of the things we talk about within the webinar is the champions model and getting some early adopters on board, which would be my other tip. I think with changing platforms or any of this, you do have to get more than just one person do it. I mean, one person can start it, but you want to get some momentum behind it.
Yeah. And the other thing I'll add to that is you could look to an outside firm, like you could hire us, for example, to help you with that type of engagement or that project.
Sure.
But it's not enough just to hire somebody like us and expect that it's going to be successful in the end. The champions model is key, right? Because you have to drive adoption and change. And at the end of the day, you need to learn how to walk with it on your own. And I've been a part of many different intranet projects or, other communication related projects where my company was paid to come in and provide a solution. And at the end of the budget, well, my time runs out. And the people that I delivered that to are left to care for and nurture that thing. And I can probably count 5 to 10 different customers where I've come back like 5 years later, bumped into them in the grocery store or at a restaurant or something, and have said, hey, how did that thing go? Like, are you guys using it? Is it good? And they're like, well, nobody uses it anymore.
Ugh,
right? It's because
that's frustrating.
They didn't
Sure.
they didn't build a champions model. They
And
treated
continued
it
to
like an
maintain.
IT project, right? It didn't become a part of the culture.
Right.
And so those are the things that really matter if you're actually going to be successful in the long term.
Right. And Andrew, we're seeing your comment here. You say, we're all over the place as far as internal communication right now. It's a mess. I've been tasked with cleaning it up. I hear you. We talk to a lot of different teams where they come to us and they say, where do we start? What's the first step? And honestly, the first step is recognizing that it's a problem, that it could get better, that there's an opportunity to make it better. So the fact that you've been tasked with it is somewhere along the line, someone's recognized we could be doing this better. So that's step one. Step two is trying to figure out how much time are we wasting because we're not good at this? And then you start to uncover some of the value. That can be difficult to measure, but everyone ultimately can measure somewhat of, it's 5 hours a week that we spend trying to track down emails back and forth.
Yeah.
Or
well, like I know some of us hate to say stuff like this, but if you communicate effectively with everyone on your team and everyone understands their role, position, and what they're responsible for and how they fit into the organization, and they understand where they're all going, and we're all going, by the way, in the same direction, toward the same goal, and they're able to progress toward that goal, they'll all be happier, and you'll probably keep them longer.
Dare we say employee retention? Yes.
Exactly.
No, I would agree with that. I heard this quote the other day. I don't remember where this was from, but I copied it down. It said, when individuals feel connected to their colleagues, they are more likely to communicate effectively, share ideas, and collaborate with enthusiasm. This strengthened bond forms the bedrock of high-performing teams. And I wrote this down because I just felt like at the very center of our intention with the webinar Matt and I put together, which I hope you all will check out, that is our intention. It's to help companies find a way to connect their internal coworkers' teams so that people feel empowered to share their ideas and collaborate effectively, and all of those things that come from feeling on the same page. And honestly, Slack/Teams has done that for me since joining Bulb Digital a year ago. And I've never been at an organization where you feel that connected and all on the same page, and it just takes away a lot of that, a lot of those walls that I think are often up within different divisions and different companies. So
that's interesting.
It's worth it to figure it out.
I like that feedback, because what that means to me as a leader here at Bulb is, well, our strategy, our communication strategy is effective in spite of the fact that we're sometimes remote, sometimes together. Right. And, I think, 100% of the world is working in this way now in terms of being, remote or able to work remotely. And so there's real concern over how effective that can be, and right. And how connected can people remain.
I think so much of it is compounded. The further you get, the less face-to-face you see each other, the more different scheduled everyone is. The thing we talked about actually on one of our podcast episodes about communication through Slack and Teams is sometimes having these open channels where you post conversations. It's like bringing it back to the days of hoteling in office where you have broke down the walls of the cubes and you actually are just having the conversation out in the open.
Right out in the open, yeah.
So these channels create the ability to have conversations out in the open in a digital space. this isn't a new idea. I'm sure many people have talked about this before, but we need that more than ever because we are so remote and hybrid, and there are very few days that everyone is going to be in an office together. So having the conversations digitally in an organized, intentional manner, it'll move the needle for sure on how people communicate.
It can be fun too.
Yeah.
Like
I enjoy it.
Giphy is a blast.
And it's true.
Right? Like
Yeah.
the office memes, like there's all kinds of like fun things you can bring into that conversation, provided your organization allows it.
Right.
We allow that stuff. Like
I do feel like sharing images and everything is a lot easier as well. Being able to grab screenshots or if we have an event and those types of things too.
Absolutely.
All of it is better than email. So if you're just emailing internally, stop doing that.
That's another thing you'll find out in the webinar.
Yeah.
We're not huge fans of email.
Yeah.
For everything.
If you're emailing internally, you're doing something wrong. So definitely go check out that webinar. And like I said, we've got another one coming up on August 30th, which is the end of this week, or the end of this month.
All right, Andrew, I see your question. So he's asking, where can you get pricing on a few hours of consultation if that's something we want to pursue? So probably the best way to do it would be to schedule a no-cost conversation, modern workplace consultation.
Yes.
And you can do that from our website. Mitch, I don't know if you want to find the link to that. And then we'll basically spend 30 minutes together, either you and me or you and Mitch or somebody else on the team, and kind of figure out if there's a fit, right? If it makes sense for us to work together.
Yep.
That would probably be the easiest way to go about that.
Yeah. And that goes for everyone joining. We do have those no-cost consultations on our website, so check it out on our webpage. And a lot of our resources, if not all of our resources, are linked through there. You can find our YouTube channel where we have all these different helpful tips.
Yep.
So next office hours is the week after Labor Day. So we've got Labor Day coming up, beginning of September, and we'll be right back here ready to answer questions on September 6th. That's a Wednesday afternoon. So if anything comes up for anyone joining in the next month, jot it down, submit it to us on our website, and we'll be ready to go for the next time.
Mitch, do we have a link handy for where they can submit questions?
Yeah, we can post that. If we were able to help you today, it does really help us to get the feedback. So if you can fill out that testimonial link, Mitch did drop that as well. We love to hear from you and hear how we've helped make you successful. And yeah, thanks for your time today, Mike. I think we answered some good questions. The ongoing debate between Slack and Teams will never officially be over, but
it was a wide range. I
yeah,
think we got deep and then we didn't drown.
We zoomed back out. Yeah. Well, check us out online and connect with us on LinkedIn and all the different ways. Thank you, everyone, for joining, and hope you have a good rest of your summer. We'll see you all back here in early September.